For years, Officer James Barnes ruled Ironwood Prison with cruelty and control, brutalizing inmates, silencing anyone who spoke out. But when Gabriel Steele was sentenced to Ironwood, everything changed. A former Delta Force operative, Gabriel was convicted of manslaughter after defending himself in a bar fight against an off-duty cop. What he didn't know was that the officer wasn't just any cop. He was James Barnes's friend. From the moment Gabriel entered Ironwood, Barnes made it his mission to destroy him. Beatings, setups, death traps designed to make sure he would not leave alive. In a place that was built for the worst of the worst, it turns out the guards are the dirtiest gang. And the only difference between the men in the cells and the ones who guard them is the badge. Now, Gabriel faces his deadliest fight yet. In a prison built for monsters, can he find a way to survive? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The air inside the courtroom felt thick, heavy, with an unspoken certainty that the verdict had been decided long before the trial even began. Rows of spectators lined the benches, their faces a mixture of contempt, curiosity, and quiet anticipation as the judge glanced over his notes, the gavel resting lightly beneath his fingertips as if he could barely be bothered to raise it before delivering a sentence that had already been written. In stone, Gabriel Steele sat motionless, his posture straight, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly on the wooden table before him, his face unreadable as the words spilled from the judge's mouth. Guilty of manslaughter. Sentenced to 25 years in maximum security. There was no gasp from the crowd, no shock or outrage. The off-duty police officer he had killed had been white. The jury had been white. The judge, the prosecution, the media that had dragged his name through the mud, white. And even though the evidence had been clear, even though the surveillance footage had shown the officer throwing the first punch, pulling his concealed weapon when he realized he was losing, it hadn't mattered. What mattered was the headlines that called Gabe a dangerous former soldier, trained to kill, unable to adjust to civilian life, a menace to society. What mattered was the public outrage manufactured by those who wanted a swift conviction, a sacrifice to satisfy the demand for justice, even if that justice was blind to the truth. He had known, even before the verdict was read, that he wasn't walking out of this courtroom as a free man, and so he remained silent, still, unreadable as the gavel struck wood, and the officers moved in, gripping his arms with just a little too much force as they pulled him to his feet. The judge was already gathering his papers, disinterested, while the prosecution exchanged quiet congratulations, not even bothering to look in Gabe's direction as they shook hands. Another case closed. The cameras caught every angle as he was led through the courtroom, bright flashes illuminating his face, capturing the image they wanted to spread. The cold, hardened expression of a killer, unrepentant and dangerous. Not a man who had defended himself, not a man who had saved countless lives overseas, who had served his country with distinction, bled for it, lost friends for it, only to come home and find that the same country saw him as nothing more than a weapon to be discarded when no longer useful. They would call him a murderer. They would say he deserved what was coming. And perhaps, after everything, they weren't entirely wrong. The transport van rattled over uneven pavement, the metal cuffs digging into his wrists as he kept his gaze forward, ignoring the low murmur of the officers seated across from him. There was a certain energy in their voices, the kind that didn't need words to be understood. They had been watching the trial, they had seen the headlines, and they had already made up their minds about him. Manslaughter, one of them muttered, shifting slightly in his seat, arms crossed over his vest. Should have been murder. The other snorted. That ain't just any cop he killed. That's Barnes's boy. That caught his attention. Just for a second. Not enough to react. Not enough to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had his interest, but enough for the words to settle deep, planting a seed of understanding. He knew the name Barnes. Victor Barnes. head of corrections at Ironwood Maximum Security Prison. He had killed a cop, and now he was being sent straight into the hands of the men who had called that cop a brother. The prison gates loomed ahead, thick steel and razor wire stretching high, watchtowers casting long shadows across the barren courtyard as the van pulled to a slow stop. Gabe took a breath, steady and measured, a habit drilled into him over years of training, combat, survival. Assess the situation. Control your response. Never let them see what you're thinking. The doors were thrown open, and the officers pulled him out, hands gripping his arms tighter than necessary, leading him into the processing area where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting the room in a sterile, sickly glow. A dozen other inmates stood in line, orange jumpsuits hanging loose over their bodies, their expressions ranging from indifferent to hostile as they took in the new arrival, the man who had made headlines. The guards stripped him down, checked for contraband, had him stand for mugshots. The camera flashed, freezing the moment in time. A soldier turned convict, a warrior caged, the media's perfect villain. Warden Samuel Briggs stood at the far end of the room, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. But his eyes carried the weight of knowing something Gabe didn't yet understand. He watched in silence as the guards processed him, as they handed him his uniform, as they led him through the winding corridors of Ironwood, past cells where men watched with a quiet, predatory curiosity, weighing, measuring, determining where he would fit into the hierarchy that ruled these walls. "Welcome home, soldier," one of the guards sneered, shoving him forward. The others laughed, but Gabe said nothing, because home wasn't a place. Home wasn't a building, a structure, a collection of walls meant to contain and confine. Home was the battlefield, the quiet hum of tension before an ambush, the slow inhale before a bullet was fired, the knowledge that survival wasn't about who was the strongest, but who was the most prepared. And right now, Ironwood was the battlefield. He felt the eyes on him, from inmates, from guards, from men who had already decided what his future would be before he had even stepped foot inside. They didn't see a man. They saw a target. They wanted him to be afraid. They wanted him to break. Gabriel Steele walked the length of the cell block, posture controlled, steps measured, his senses alert even as his face remained impassive. The trick was not letting them see it, not letting them read the tension tightening in his chest, the cold grip of understanding settling deep in his gut. This wasn't like a war zone where threats were obvious, where danger came in clear, identifiable shapes. Here, it was everywhere, constant, waiting for the first mistake. A guard, thick around the middle but built like a refrigerator, led him down the row of cells with a smirk that said he was enjoying every second of this. "This here's your new home, Steele," the guard said, coming to a stop outside a darkened cell. He jabbed a thick finger toward the narrow opening. "Try not to piss your pants in there, and do yourself a favor. Don't snore. I hear your new bunkmate's got a short fuse." Gabe didn't react, but his mind sharpened. First impressions mattered. His cellmate had been here longer, which meant he controlled the space. If the guy was a problem, then this was another test, one the guards were probably hoping would turn ugly. The steel doors groaned open, and the moment he stepped inside, Gabe knew he wasn't alone. His cellmate was stretched out on the bottom bunk, arms folded behind his head, gaze locked on the ceiling. He wasn't asleep. He was waiting. Gabe didn't speak right away. He took in the details. Mid-40s, lean but solid. His arms marked with faded ink, the kind that meant something, not the sloppy gang signatures most of the younger inmates wore. The man finally let out a slow breath and turned his head just enough to glance up at him. Well, I was expecting some street punk. Got me a soldier instead, not hostile, but not friendly either. Just watching, measuring." "Yeah," Gabe muttered. The man nodded slightly before sitting up, stretching his shoulders. "Name's Malcolm Reed," he said. You can call me Reed. Gabe Steele. Reed smirked. Yeah, I know. Everyone in here knows who you are. That was exactly what Gabe had expected. I'd ask how, Gabe said, lowering himself onto the top bunk. But I think I already know. Reed chuckled, resting his elbows on his knees. You made headlines, man. Cop killer ain't the kind of label that goes unnoticed in a place like this. People been waiting to see what kind of man you really are. People. Gabe knew that didn't just mean the inmates. And the guards? Gabe asked. What's their angle? Reed's smirk faded. He sighed, leaning back against the wall. Their angle? Same as it always is. Control. Barnes, that's the head guard, runs things around here like his own personal fight club. He's got his favorites, guys he keeps in his pocket, and then he's got the ones like you, the ones they want to break. Gabe already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. Because I killed a cop? Reed shrugged. Because you killed a cop they liked. A lot of these guards, they ain't just work buddies. They're family. Barnes and that officer you put in the ground grew up together. They served together too, but not like you did. They were badge-wearing bullies who liked having power over people who couldn't fight back. So, yeah, Barnes ain't just pissed. He's personal about it. Gabe exhaled slowly, letting that settle. It wasn't just about survival. It was vengeance. What about the inmates? How's it split? Reed scratched the side of his jaw, considering. Same as anywhere else. You got the gangs. Whites stick with whites, blacks with blacks. Latinos got their own structure. Then you got the lifers, the guys who don't give a damn about politics and just want to survive. But never mind all that. The most dangerous gang in here are the guards, and they're the ones who want you. Gabe let that sink in. He wasn't worried about the gangbangers. They had rules, structure, a code, even if it was a brutal one. But the men who controlled the prison, that was a different kind of threat. And you? Gabe asked after a moment. Reed smirked. What about me? Where do you fit? Reed stretched, letting out a low sigh. I've been in this hellhole 15 years, long enough to know how the game's played, but not so long that I want to roll over for it. He eyed Gabe for a moment, his expression unreadable. You ain't like these other guys. You ain't some street kid who got caught with a bad deal. And you sure as hell ain't built for this life. So, tell me, soldier boy, what's your play? Gabe thought about that. His play? Survive. That was the first goal. But survival wasn't enough. My play, Gabe muttered. Right now. Keep breathing. Reed let out a sharp laugh. Yeah, well, that's a good place to start. The lights flickered overhead, signaling lights out. Reed stretched and lay back down, sighing as he settled onto the thin mattress. Get some sleep, Steele. They're just getting started with you. Gabe didn't respond. He climbed onto the top bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind already picking apart everything Reed had told him, every move the guards had made, every step that had led him here. He had been in danger before. He had been hunted before. But Ironwood wasn't a battlefield. It was something worse, and if he didn't start thinking 3 steps ahead, he wouldn't last long enough to see the outside world again. The prison yard stretched before him, a vast, sun-baked slab of cracked concrete, enclosed by razor wire and looming guard towers, where the men inside watched with lazy, disinterested stares, their rifles slung across their chests. Not one of them was looking to prevent violence. No. The only time they'd intervene was when someone wasn't playing by their rules. Gabriel Steele had seen yards like this before, in war zones where men with nothing left to lose gathered like jackals, waiting to see who was weak, who was strong, who was about to be made an example of. Some worked out, pushing their bodies to the breaking point in preparation for the next fight. Others gathered in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones, dealing in favors, alliances, debts. And then there were the watchers, the ones who leaned against the walls, eyes scanning, waiting for the inevitable. Gabe understood the hierarchy now. Reed had made it clear on their walk to the yard, speaking low, smooth, never stopping, never breaking pace. Keep moving. Never let them corner you. It ain't about who's toughest in here. It's about who's got the most leverage, Reed had murmured. You? You ain't got none yet. But Barnes? He's got all the cards, and he wants to see me fold. Reed had smirked. Oh, he wants more than that, Steele. He wants to see you bleed. Now, standing near the fence, feeling the heat of the sun pressing down on his shoulders, Gabe knew he was being watched. Not just by inmates sizing him up, but by the ones with real power here, the guards. And, sure enough, it didn't take long before one of them came for him. He saw it before he heard it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way conversations died down as a single uniformed figure made his way across the yard. Boots heavy against the pavement, the other guards near the fences shifting slightly to give him room, a display of authority, a message. Barnes. Gabe exhaled slowly, steadying himself, controlling his breath, his posture, his reaction. No sudden moves. No tells. The head of the guards was a thick-bodied man in his 40s, his uniform stretched tight across his chest, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms lined with old scars, the kind that spoke of years in the system, years of getting away with things men like him should never be allowed to get away with. His belt was heavy with tools of enforcement, baton, keys, cuffs, but he didn't need them. Not yet. Barnes stopped in front of him, tilting his head slightly, his mouth pulling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Steele," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "How's life treating you in my house?" Gabe didn't answer. Barnes clicked his tongue, shaking his head like he was disappointed. "See? That right there? That's your problem. No respect. No gratitude. I mean, I could have had you put in a hole your first night. But instead, I let you walk around, make friends, get settled. And this is how you thank me?" Gabe met his stare evenly. "Didn't know I owed you a thank you." The air tightened. The yard was watching. Barnes let out a slow chuckle, stepping closer, just inside Gabe's space now, forcing him to hold his ground, or give way. A power move. A test. "You don't know how things work yet, soldier boy. But you will." Gabe kept his jaw locked, his stance firm. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he was right. Barnes moved fast, not with the brute force of a man trying to beat someone down, but with the cruel precision of someone who had done this before, who knew exactly how to inflict pain without leaving a mark. His hand clamped down on Gabe's shoulder, fingers digging in like iron. A grip that looked casual from the outside but carried a quiet, punishing strength, pressing against the muscle in a way that sent sharp, controlled pain radiating through his back. Gabe didn't react, didn't flinch. Barnes leaned in slightly, voice dropping lower. "You're a tough one." "That's good. I like tough. Means you'll last longer before you break." The fingers dug deeper, his grip tightening. A small show of power, nothing big enough to cause a scene, but enough to say exactly what needed to be said. Gabe felt the pain. He absorbed it, filed it away. This wasn't a fight worth winning. Not yet. "You killed my friend," Barnes murmured, his voice quieter now, only for him to hear. "You should be rotting in the dirt with him. But lucky me, I get to watch you rot in here instead." Gabe inhaled. Slow, steady, let it settle, let it pass. "That all you came here to say?" Barnes grinned, releasing him, giving his shoulder one last sharp squeeze before stepping back, turning just slightly to glance toward the other guards. "Nah," he said. "Just wanted to let you know, we ain't even started yet." He gave Gabe a pat on the chest, hard enough to push him back a step, then turned and walked away, his boots slow and deliberate against the concrete. Gabe didn't move, didn't rub his shoulder, even though the ache was spreading deep into the muscle. He simply stood there, absorbing the moment, feeling the tension still lingering in the air. He knew what had just happened. A public warning, a declaration. "You're mine, and there's nothing you can do about it." Reed's voice came from behind him, quiet, but edged with something sharp. Told you he was personal about this. Gabe let out a slow breath, turning just enough to glance at his cellmate. Reed had seen it all. Yeah, Gabe muttered. I got that impression. Reed studied him for a moment, his gaze flicking to the spot where Barnes had grabbed him. You good? I've had worse. Reed gave him a look that was half amusement, half something else. Maybe approval, maybe recognition. Yeah, he said. You probably have. The yard slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Weights clanked. The tension settled back into the usual background hum of danger that never fully left this place. But something had changed. They had seen it. The guards, the inmates, everyone. Barnes had made his move, and now they were all waiting to see what Gabe would do next. The sun had barely moved in the sky by the time they were herded back inside, the yard doors slamming shut behind them with the deep metallic groan of reinforced steel locking into place. Gabe could still feel the pressure of Barnes's fingers in his shoulder, the dull, lingering ache where the head guard had gripped him like a vice. But it wasn't the pain that occupied his mind. It was the message. That wasn't just a warning. That was a promise. Barnes wanted him to know that this was his world, that he controlled the board, the pieces, and every move that would come next. And more importantly, that Gabe had no say in it. That was the real game here. Control, power, submission. And yet, despite knowing that, despite the way his gut told him he should be bracing for something worse, he felt himself relaxing, just a little, as he followed the slow, methodical shuffle of inmates back toward their cell block. Reed walked beside him, neither of them speaking, just listening, just reading the air the way men like them always did, because the air was different now. The way the inmates looked at him had shifted, some with curiosity, some with quiet approval, but most with calculated indifference, the kind that meant they were waiting to see if he would break, if he would bend, if he would fight back and make himself a target, waiting to see if he had just become part of the system, or if he was about to become something else entirely. A few steps past the last guard post, something changed, the shift in footsteps, the unnatural silence. Gabe barely had time to turn before two sets of hands grabbed him at once. One clamped onto his arm, twisting his wrist hard enough to send a jolt of pain up his forearm. The other caught his collar, yanking him sideways, off balance, dragging him into the narrow break between two rows of cells. The concrete walls boxed them in, no windows, no view from the walkways. No one would be stopping this. They had planned it well. A quick check told him everything he needed to know. Two men. One taller, lean but wiry, muscles tight beneath inked skin. The other shorter, but thick, built like a battering ram, arms dense with old scars. Lifers. They had a certain way of moving, a weight to their steps that came with knowing they were never leaving this place. The taller one smirked. Confidence? Overconfidence. You must be steel, he said, his grip tightening. Man, you made some real bad friends fast. The shorter one chuckled. Barnes says you think you're a fighter. Guess we'll see. Barnes. Of course. This is what he sent you for? Gabe muttered, keeping his voice even, controlling his breath, his pulse. What did he promise you? Does it matter? The tall one asked, jerking him forward, trying to throw him off balance. Gabe let it happen. Just for a second. Let them think they were in control. I like knowing how a man sells himself, Gabe answered, scanning their footing, their weight distribution. Commissary? Protection? Extra yard time? Doesn't take much, the shorter one said, stepping in closer. And we get to have a little fun, too. That was enough. Gabe moved. His right arm, the one the tall man had been twisting, snapped inward, breaking free just enough to shift his weight. Then he dropped, low, lower than they expected. The sudden shift pulled them both off balance, the kind of mistake that was minor in a brawl, but deadly in a real fight. Gabe planted his left foot hard, swinging his right elbow back, up, fast. The impact cracked against the tall one's jaw, a sharp, clean strike. The man's head snapped sideways, and in the half-second that followed, Gabe twisted his body, slamming his shoulder into the shorter one's midsection. The force drove the man back against the wall. A grunt of pain, but he wasn't down. The tall one recovered first, shaking off the hit, rage overtaking his smirk. He lunged. Gabe stepped into the attack. A sharp pivot, redirecting the weight, using it against him. He caught the man's wrist, twisted it outward, a perfect joint lock, then slammed him into the wall. The impact sent a shudder through the concrete. The man's body stiffened, then slumped. The shorter one was already moving, coming in low, swinging with brute force. A mistake. Gabe shifted left. Not much, just enough to let the attack pass. Then he struck. A sharp knee to the ribs, followed by a palm strike to the nose, sending the man stumbling. It was over. The shorter one wheezed, pressing a hand to his ribs. The tall one was still slumped against the wall, dazed. Neither was in any shape to fight. Gabe exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. Then he stepped forward. "Tell me what else Barnes said." The short one coughed, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter." "It does to me." A pause. Then, finally, the tall one muttered, voice hoarse, "You ain't leaving this place standing, Steele." Gabe didn't move, didn't look away. "That what Barnes told you?" The man hesitated. Then he gave a slow nod. "You're not the first he's done this to. You won't be the last." Gabe already knew that. But hearing it confirmed something else entirely. Who else is he lining up? The short one exhaled through his nose, wincing. "It ain't about who, it's about when." Gabe's jaw tightened. "Barnes doesn't need one guy to take you out," the tall one muttered, shaking his head. "He's got the whole place." Gabe let that sink in. Then he stepped back. The two men didn't move. They wouldn't. Not after this. A low whistle cut through the air. Reed. He stood at the edge of the corridor, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Come on, soldier boy," he muttered, "before they send more." Gabe gave the two men one last look, then turned and walked toward Reed, feeling their eyes on his back. Not vengeful, not even angry. Just waiting, because they knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The walk back to the cell block was slow, deliberate, not because of hesitation, but because Gabe needed time to think. The weight of what had just happened still clung to the air around him, and though no alarms had sounded, no guards had come storming in to break up the fight, the message was clear. Barnes didn't need to hide what he was doing. He owned this place. And now, so did everyone else. Reed walked beside him, quiet, his expression unreadable. But Gabe could feel the scrutiny. The older man had seen everything. He had been watching, not just the fight, but the way Gabe had handled it, the way he had controlled it. They reached the cell block, stepping through the steel doors just as they groaned shut behind them, the mechanical locks slamming into place with the kind of finality that reinforced the truth of this place. You don't leave unless they let you. Gabe exhaled, rolling his shoulders, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving behind a dull ache where Barnes had grabbed him earlier, the deeper strain of exertion settling into his muscles from the fight. He could feel every place their hands had been, every joint that had strained, every impact he had delivered. Reed didn't speak until they reached their cell. "That could have gone worse," he muttered, stepping inside, his tone neutral. "Yeah," Gabe said, lowering himself onto the bottom bunk this time, letting his back hit the wall. "Could have gone a lot worse." Reed leaned against the opposite side of the cell, watching him for a long moment before shaking his head. "Barnes isn't gonna stop, you know." Gabe looked up, his expression calm but questioning. "I figured." Reed exhaled, stretching his arms over his head, before settling down onto the top bunk. "I'm not just talking about sending guys after you," he said. "I mean, he's not gonna stop until you're out of the picture. You think you're the first guy to come through here that didn't play by his rules? The first one that didn't roll over?" Gabe narrowed his eyes. "How many?" Reed shook his head. "Too many." That sat heavy between them. Gabe adjusted his posture slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "What happened to them?" Reed was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Different things. Some ended up on the wrong end of a shank. Some got themselves into accidents. Stairwells, showers, even their own cells. A couple of guys just disappeared. No explanation, no report. Just gone. Gabe let that settle. None of it surprised him. And the guards? Reed's mouth twisted into something close to a smirk. But there was no amusement behind it. They don't need to get their hands dirty, he said. They just set things in motion. Whisper the right things in the right ears. Cut a deal here. Look the other way there. The gangs do the rest. And when it's all said and done, they file it as a prison dispute, close the book, and move on like it never happened. Gabe nodded slowly. It was efficient, brutal, practiced. And the warden? Reed let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Briggs? He scoffed. Man, he's been in the game too long to care. As long as the money flows and the place doesn't burn to the ground, he's fine letting Barnes run the show. Half the things that happen in here don't even reach his desk. And the ones that do? He shrugged. Let's just say, if Barnes hands him a report, he signs it without reading. Gabe absorbed that. It fit. So, what about you? He asked after a moment. Reed raised an eyebrow. What about me? How much time you got left? Reed's lips pressed together for a moment before he exhaled. 2 years, he said. With good behavior, maybe less. That made Gabe pause. He had assumed Reed was a lifer, the way he carried himself, the way he seemed at peace with the system. It felt like he had been here long enough to know he wasn't getting out. What are you in for? Gabe asked. Reed gave him a look. What do you think? I don't know, Gabe said. That's why I asked. Reed leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, it seemed like he wasn't going to answer. I killed a man, he said finally. Gabe didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. Reed let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the metal railing of the bunk. My brother owed money to some bad people. Couldn't pay it. They sent a guy to collect. I stepped in. He rolled his shoulders slightly. Things got out of hand. 1 second we were talking. The next, he was on the ground, not moving. Gabe studied him. You regret it? Reed's jaw tightened slightly. I regret that I didn't think before I acted, he admitted. But I don't regret protecting my brother. That was an answer Gabe understood. So why are you helping me? He asked after a moment. Reed smirked. Who says I'm helping you? Gabe gave him a look. Reed exhaled, shaking his head. Look, Steele, I'm not sticking my neck out for nothing, he said. But I've been in here long enough to know a dead man walking when I see one. Barnes isn't just playing with you. He's setting you up for something big. And if you go down, I don't want to be anywhere near the blast radius. So this is self-preservation, Reed smiled. You could call it that. Gabe nodded. Then what's your play? Reed's smile faded slightly. Stay out of trouble. Keep my head down. Walk out of here in 2 years and never look back. Think that's gonna work? Reed let out a dry chuckle. I'll let you know in 2 years. The block was quieter now. Most of the inmates had settled in for the night. The hum of conversation fading as men resigned themselves to another day behind walls they would never escape. Gabe leaned his head back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, letting everything settle. He had answers now. Not enough, but more than before. Barnes wasn't just pushing him. He was orchestrating something. And if Gabe didn't find a way to get ahead of it, he wouldn't be walking out of here at all. The night had passed in silence, but Gabe had barely slept. He had learned how to function on little rest a long time ago. How to let his body recover, even when his mind refused to shut down. In the field, sleep had been a luxury. Something you stole in short bursts between missions, between gunfire, between the moments where you had no choice but to stay awake or die. This wasn't a war zone, not in the traditional sense, but the principles were the same. Barnes wasn't finished. The fight in the corridor had been nothing more than a test, a move designed to gauge his response, to see if he would cave, break, or retaliate in a way that would justify something worse. Gabe had seen it before. Pressure applied slowly, strategically, tightening the noose without the victim even realizing it was happening. That was how they did it here. Not all at once, not in a way that could be traced, but in small, deliberate steps that led to an inevitable conclusion. Reed had been asleep when Gabe finally closed his eyes, but by the time the morning call sounded, he was already up, leaning against the bunk, rubbing a hand over his face as the first voices stirred in the block. "You good?" Reed asked, his voice low, not just out of caution, but because that was how you talked in a place like this. Controlled, measured, never letting anyone else hear more than they needed to. "Fine," Gabe muttered, rolling his shoulders, feeling the stiffness settling into his joints. Reed gave him a look, one that said he wasn't convinced, but he didn't push. He just nodded and stood, stretching slightly as the guards started moving through the tier, unlocking cells, barking orders, forcing men into the daily grind of their routine. "You'll want to watch yourself today," Reed said quietly as they stepped out, moving with the crowd toward the common area. "Barnes doesn't like when things don't go his way. He's going to remind you who's in charge." Gabe already knew that. He had been waiting for it, and Barnes didn't make him wait long. They were in the hallway leading to the cafeteria when it happened. Gabe had been walking beside Reed, feeling the slow hum of conversation around them, the weight of stares still lingering from the day before. Some men watched with quiet approval, others with indifference, but most with the kind of gaze that came from men waiting for a show. They had seen what happened. They wanted to see what came next. The crowd thinned near the entrance, and that was when he felt it, a shift in movement, a presence, just behind him. Then, a hand gripping his shoulder, fingers digging in hard, yanking him back. Before he could fully react, a second hand shoved against his chest, forcing him off balance, slamming him into the nearest wall with a hard thud. Not Barnes. The man staring him down was someone else, but the uniform said everything Gabe needed to know. A guard, broad shoulders, thick jaw, an expression that made it clear he was enjoying this. "You think you're smart," the guard muttered, his voice low, sharp. "You think you're gonna walk around here like you own the place?" Gabe met his eyes, steady, assessing, the way the man spoke, the way he carried himself. It wasn't personal, not like Barnes. This was a job, an order. Barnes had sent him. "Didn't realize I was making an impression," Gabe said, keeping his tone calm, neutral. The guard's grip tightened, his fingers digging into the muscle of Gabe's shoulder, his stance shifting slightly to block the view from the hallway behind him. "Barnes doesn't like you making waves," he muttered, "and I don't like doing favors for him, but I dislike you even more." Gabe let the words settle, watching the way the man's weight shifted. He was getting ready for something. Then, the punch came fast. A hard right hook straight to the cheekbone, the kind that wasn't meant to drop him, but to hurt, to make a point. Pain exploded through the side of Gabe's face, a sharp, deep throb spreading through his jaw, his head snapping slightly with the force of the impact. He absorbed it, controlled his breathing, refused to react. The guard stepped back, shaking out his fist slightly. "That's just a taste," he muttered. "Next time, I won't stop." Gabe exhaled slowly, blood pooling near the corner of his mouth. He could feel the eyes on him, watching, waiting. And then a voice cut through the air. "Steele! Visitor!" The moment shifted instantly. The guard tensed, his jaw tightening as he turned toward the sound. Another officer stood a few feet away, clipboard in hand, face unreadable. "Now?" the guard asked, irritation bleeding into his voice. The other officer nodded. The first guard exhaled sharply, looking back at Gabe, his expression unreadable, but laced with something close to frustration. His moment had been stolen. "This isn't over," he muttered before stepping back. Gabe didn't answer. He pushed off the wall, keeping his stance controlled, his breathing measured, and followed the other officer down the hall. He could still feel the first guard's eyes on him the entire way. The visitation room was small, plain, separated by a thick pane of reinforced glass, with a row of old telephones mounted on the wall. No physical contact, no privacy. Everything recorded. Gabe had been expecting Jessica, the journalist. Maybe Ryan. He hadn't been expecting a lawyer. The man sitting on the other side of the glass was in his early 50s, dressed in a sharp but modest suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, glasses perched on his nose as he studied a folder in his hands. Calm, collected. The kind of man who had been in 1,000 of these rooms and had long since stopped reacting to what he saw. Gabe picked up the receiver slowly. The man did the same. "Mr. Steele," he said, voice smooth, professional. "I'm Daniel Grayson. I've been retained to represent you." Gabe studied him. "By who?" Grayson smiled slightly. "A mutual friend." That narrowed the possibilities. "Ryan." Grayson nodded. "He reached out a few weeks ago, started looking into your case. Let's just say, he found a few things that didn't add up. So did I." Gabe leaned forward slightly. "Like what?" Grayson set the folder down, flipping it open. "For starters, the evidence in your original case. The prosecution withheld security footage from the bar that night. Footage that showed the officer you allegedly killed was the one who escalated the situation. The fact that this evidence was never presented at trial? That's more than just an oversight. It's suppression." Gabe had suspected as much. Now he had confirmation. "How do you prove it?" "We're working on that. Jessica Lane is already chasing leads. We need more. But the good news is, your case isn't as closed as they want it to be." Gabe exhaled slowly. "What's the bad news?" Grayson folded his hands. "Your situation in here." "Barnes." Grayson nodded. "We know how this place works. And we know that the longer you stay, the worse it's going to get." Gabe let that settle. "So, what's the play?" Grayson's eyes met his. "We get you out before they find a way to bury you for good." Gabe nodded once. Slow. "I hope you move fast," he muttered. Grayson's expression darkened slightly. "So do I." The walk back from the visitation room felt different. For the first time since he had stepped foot in Ironwood, Gabe Steele wasn't just thinking about survival. He was thinking about getting out. Before today, the idea of walking free had been nothing more than a distant possibility. A fading light in the back of his mind that he had refused to dwell on. Hope was dangerous in a place like this. Hope made you hesitate when you needed to act. Hope made you weak. But now there was a path, a real one. His case wasn't closed. The truth was out there, buried under lies, hidden by men who had built their careers on keeping it that way. But the cracks were forming. Ryan and Jessica were working on the outside, and Grayson had a plan. For the first time since his sentence began, Gabe wasn't just fighting to stay alive, he was fighting to get out. He just had to survive long enough to see it through. The guard escorting him back said nothing, and Gabe preferred it that way. His mind was already shifting gears, running through the next steps, the possibilities. Barnes would escalate things. That was a certainty. He had already sent men after him, had tried intimidation, had made it clear that this wasn't just about putting a troublesome inmate in his place. This was personal. Barnes wanted him broken, if not physically, then mentally. He wanted to see Gabe on his knees, wanted to strip away everything that made him dangerous, everything that made him a man who refused to play by the rules of this place. But now, Gabe had something more dangerous than resilience. He had something to fight for, and that meant Barnes had to move fast. He was still turning the thought over in his mind when the escorting guard stopped short just outside his tier. Gabe's instincts sharpened. Something was wrong. Then, he saw him. Barnes was waiting. The head of corrections stood just inside the tier, arms crossed, his expression the picture of smug satisfaction, like a man who had already won the game before his opponent had even realized they were playing. Gabe slowed his steps, keeping his face unreadable as he approached. He could feel the weight of the inmates watching from their cells, the low hum of conversation that always filled these walls, dipping into a quiet anticipation. Barnes smiled. "Steele," he drawled, unfolding his arms. "Heard you had yourself a nice little visit. Must be nice, having people on the outside still wasting their time on you." Gabe said nothing. Barnes sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. "I've got to say, I was hoping you'd take the easy road. Would have made things simple. But now you're making me work for it." He turned slightly, motioning to one of the guards standing nearby. The man stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "See? I had a thought," Barnes continued, his voice smooth, casual. "You've been making quite a few friends in here. You and Reed, thick as thieves. Thought maybe it was time to shake things up a little." The guard handed him the clipboard. Barnes glanced at it, then looked back at Gabe. "You're being relocated." The words settled like iron. Barnes's grin widened, effective immediately. "You'll be moved to a new cell, fresh start, new surroundings, new company." Gabe felt the shift in the air, the weight behind those words. "Who?" Barnes turned the clipboard around, tapping a finger against the name written there. Gabe read it once. Then again, he knew the name. Everyone in Ironwood knew the name. Logan the Butcher, Trask. A man with 3 confirmed kills inside these walls alone. A man who had spent more time in solitary than in Gen Pop, whose violent streak was so infamous that even the worst of Ironwood's lifers gave him a wide berth. A man who didn't have allies, only bodies. Barnes let him absorb that for a moment before stepping closer, lowering his voice just enough so that no one else could hear. "I hope you weren't getting too comfortable," he murmured, his voice laced with amusement. "Would hate to see you get too attached to your new future. Might not be around long enough to see it." Gabe felt the burn of adrenaline in his veins, but he controlled it, controlled his breath, controlled the way his muscles tensed. Barnes wanted a reaction. He wouldn't get one. Instead, Gabe straightened, locked eyes with him, and let a slow breath escape his nose. "You're getting desperate," he said, voice calm. Barnes's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Then the smile widened. "Not desperate, Steele," he said, stepping back. "Just efficient." He turned to the guard holding the clipboard. "Move him." Gabe felt the guards close in around him, the firm grip on his arms as they pulled him forward, leading him away from the tier, away from the only ally he had in this place. He kept his breathing steady, his footsteps even. This was another move, another step toward whatever Barnes had planned. But that was fine, because now Gabe had a plan too, and he wasn't about to let Barnes win. The march toward his new cell was slow and deliberate, the guards taking their time, ensuring that every step Gabe took felt heavier than the last. They wanted him to feel it, the shift, the isolation. Reed was gone now. That meant no more conversations, no more quiet warnings, no more second set of eyes to help him navigate the landmines Barnes had laid. He was on his own again, exactly where Barnes wanted him. As they led him past rows of cells, he could feel the weight of every stare, the way conversations dipped into murmurs, the way men who had been here long enough to understand the game recognized what was happening. A cell transfer was never just a transfer. Not in Ironwood. It was a setup. They stopped in front of the last cell on the block, a dimly lit, narrow space where the air felt heavier, the kind of place where men either adapted or didn't last long enough to regret it. The guard to his left smirked as he unlocked the door. "You're gonna love this guy," he muttered, barely hiding the amusement in his tone. Gabe didn't react, didn't give him the satisfaction of asking, didn't let himself overthink it. He just stepped forward. The door groaned open. Inside, sitting on the lower bunk, arms stretched lazily along his knees, was Logan the Butcher Trask, and he was already watching. The man wasn't as large as some of the other enforcers in this place, but size didn't matter when someone carried that kind of presence. His arms were thick, lined with tattoos that left no room for interpretation. White supremacist insignias, prison ink that carried meaning far beyond the skin. His face was lean, sharp, his head shaved clean. His eyes an icy shade of blue that held the kind of casual malice that only came from a man who had long since stopped viewing human life as anything more than a commodity. The guards let Gabe step inside before slamming the door shut behind him. Silence. Trask didn't move, didn't shift, didn't tense. He just sat there, watching, the slow, steady tap of his fingers against his knee the only sound between them. A long, unbroken moment stretched. Then, finally, he spoke. "Ain't never had a black cellmate before." Gabe exhaled slowly through his nose, stepping forward just enough to show he wasn't hesitating. "Never had a cellmate like me before." Trask smirked. "That a fact?" "It is." Another pause. Then, Trask leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, studying Gabe like a man deciding whether or not to bother killing a stray dog. "See, Barnes tells me you're a fighter," he murmured, "a real tough one. Says you think you're different from the rest of the trash in here. That true?" Gabe didn't answer. Trask let out a slow chuckle, nodding slightly to himself. "Thought so." He stretched, his muscles shifting beneath the ink, then stood, slow and deliberate, just enough to test the space between them. Gabe didn't move. Trask stepped forward, close enough now that Gabe could see the faint scars along his knuckles, the signs of a man who had put more bodies on the floor than he could probably count. "So, here's the deal, soldier boy," Trask murmured, voice quiet, but carrying enough weight to fill the room. "You and me? We ain't gonna be friends. I don't care where you came from, what you did out there, or how many men you put in the dirt. Only thing I care about is what happens in here." Gabe held his ground. "And what happens in here?" Trask's smirk deepened. "That depends on you." The tension settled like thick air in the cell, neither man moving, neither one blinking. Gabe had seen killers before. He had faced down men who lived for the fight, who thrived in chaos, who breathed violence the way other men breathed air. Trask was one of them. He didn't make threats because he didn't need to. He wasn't a man who postured or bragged. He was the kind of man who had nothing to prove, and that made him dangerous. After a long moment, Trask's smirk faded slightly. "I don't like people in my space," he muttered, stepping back toward his bunk, "and I don't like surprises. So let's keep things simple, yeah?" "Simple works for me," Gabe said. Trask nodded once, satisfied, then dropped back onto his bed, stretching his arms behind his head like a man who didn't have a care in the world. Gabe didn't move for a moment, his mind already shifting gears, adjusting, recalibrating. This wasn't a fight. Not yet. But it could be. And if it was, he had to be ready. He climbed onto the top bunk, moving slow, controlled, forcing his muscles to relax even as his pulse stayed steady, even as his instincts told him to sleep with one eye open. Because men like Trask didn't need a reason to kill, and Gabe had just stepped into a world where one mistake could be his last. The tension inside the cell never fully settled. Gabe had spent the night in a state of half-rest, half-readiness, his mind alert to every shift in the mattress below him, every breath that wasn't his own. Trask didn't move much. He slept like a man used to violence, a man comfortable enough with danger that he didn't need to stay awake for it. But Gabe knew better than to trust stillness. Some men attacked in anger, others waited, let the moment stretch, made sure their target felt safe before the knife slid between their ribs. So, he kept himself balanced on that fine edge between rest and awareness, letting his body recover while his instincts stayed sharp. When the first sounds of morning movement filled the cell block, he rolled from the top bunk and landed with controlled ease, stretching out the stiffness in his joints. Trask hadn't said a word to him since their first conversation, but the way the man watched him, the slow, quiet assessments in his gaze, told Gabe that the white supremacist was still measuring, still deciding. It wasn't a question of if Trask would attack. It was a question of when, and Barnes was going to make sure it happened sooner rather than later. The moment came before breakfast, a sudden sharp buzz from the intercom. Then, the heavy stomp of boots. The entire block went silent as a team of guards flooded in, their movements controlled, rehearsed, the kind of precision that came with preparation, not random routine. Gabe's stomach tightened. He had seen enough raids to know this wasn't just a random shakedown. It was an execution, just in a different form. 2 guards stopped at the front of the cell, while another 3 flanked the door. Then, finally, a figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate. The kind of entrance a man made when he knew he had already won. Barnes. His expression carried the same smug, self-satisfied amusement it always did. But today, there was something extra, something deeper. Enjoyment. He was going to savor this. "Cell search," Barnes announced, loud enough for the whole block to hear. "Step back. Hands where I can see 'em." Trask let out a slow, annoyed exhale, but he didn't argue. He just leaned back against the wall, arms up, watching. Gabe followed, stepping back, his face unreadable, but his mind already shifting, calculating. The timing, the guards, the expression on Barnes's face. Something had already been decided. The guards moved fast, precise, tearing through the bunks, pulling apart the thin mattress padding, overturning what little storage space they had. It was all a show. The moment the third guard found something, Gabe knew what it was before he even saw it. A small plastic-wrapped bundle, pulled from the corner of Trask's mattress. White powder. Drugs. A sharp, sharp silence filled the air. Gabe didn't move. Trask went completely still. Then, the inevitable reaction. "What the—" His voice was sharp, rising with real, unfiltered anger as he lunged forward, only to be stopped by two guards grabbing him by the arms, yanking him back. His face twisted in rage, not at them, at Gabe. "That ain't mine!" Trask snarled, his breath heavy, shoulders coiled with fury. "That wasn't." Barnes held up a hand, silencing him with a look of practiced, false sympathy. Now, he said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't get too worked up, Trask. Things like this happen. Contraband moves through the block all the time. Looks like your new buddy brought some bad habits with him." Gabe felt it before he saw it. The slow, creeping shift in the way Trask's eyes settled on him. Barnes was making him believe this was all Gabe's doing. It was subtle, but effective. A man like Trask didn't think, didn't question. He reacted. And in his world, a black man setting him up for a fall wasn't just an insult. It was an offense that had only one kind of punishment: death. Trask jerked against the guards, trying to shake them off, his face twisted in absolute rage. "You set me up, you worthless!" The words barely made it out before Barnes sighed, shaking his head, as if the entire situation was just a shame. "That's enough," he said. "Trask, you know the rules. Contraband possession gets you time in the hole." Trask's fury boiled over as the guards dragged him back, forcing his arms behind his back. "This ain't mine. You know it ain't mine." Barnes smirked. "I don't make the rules, Trask," he said. "I just enforce them." Gabe stayed silent, his stance calm but locked. There was nothing to say, nothing that would make a difference. The guards had already begun hauling Trask toward the end of the tier, leading him to solitary confinement. But the man wasn't going quietly, not without one final message. He turned his head over his shoulder, his rage burning through every syllable. "Next time I see you steal, you're dead." The words carried through the block like a final decree. Every inmate had heard them. Barnes had heard them. And Barnes? He was smiling. He waited until Trask's screams faded into the distance, until the doors to the block locked back into place, until the murmurs of the other prisoners had turned into a low, whispering hum of anticipation. Then he turned back to Gabe. "Looks like you made another enemy," he said, voice easy, amused. "Not surprising, really. You don't seem to make friends easy." Gabe didn't blink, didn't speak. Barnes's smile widened. "See? This is what I like about my job," he continued. "People always think power comes from control, from authority, but it doesn't. It comes from knowing how to push people just far enough that they destroy themselves for you." He stepped in, lowering his voice just enough that no one else could hear. "Trask is gonna kill you," he murmured, "and I won't have to lift a finger." A beat of silence. Then Gabe smiled, just slightly, just enough. Barnes's expression faltered for the first time. "You think something's funny?" Gabe tilted his head slightly, voice low, even. "You've been trying to break me since the second I got here. Why are you hoping someone else does the job for you? His gaze locked on Barnes, unwavering. That tells me something. Barnes didn't respond, but the way his shoulders shifted, just slightly, told Gabe he was listening. It tells me, Gabe continued, voice deliberate, that you're getting nervous. The smile on Barnes's face froze for a split second. Just a flash, just enough for Gabe to see it. Then it was gone. The smug amusement returned, but now it felt thinner, stretched. Enjoy your new space, Steele, Barnes muttered. Won't be yours for long. Then, with a final glance, he turned and walked away. Gabe exhaled slowly, his body still, his pulse steady. Barnes wanted him dead, but the fact that he hadn't done it himself meant that he stood a chance. Now, Gabe just had to figure out why. And fast. The weight of the setup still clung to the air around him long after Barnes had walked away. Long after the guards had dragged Trask off to solitary, his shouts echoing through the block long enough that everyone had heard them, long enough to ensure that when he came back, his first and only thought would be revenge. Gabe had spent the night in a cell that wasn't his own, one that carried the presence of a man who would gladly slit his throat the second an opportunity presented itself. Even with Trask locked away for now, the message had already been delivered. Barnes wasn't finished, not by a long shot, and that meant Gabe needed answers. The yard was the same as always, tense, watched, its every movement dictated by silent, unspoken rules. Men gathered in groups, sticking to their own, following the divisions that had existed long before he ever stepped through these gates. Some worked out, muscles flexing under the weight of iron bars and battered concrete benches. Others played cards, their conversations slow and methodical, filled with veiled threats and half-promises that would be paid in blood. Gabe kept his pace even as he crossed the space, ignoring the way eyes lingered on him just a little too long. Curiosity and expectation tangled together. Word had spread. Everyone knew what had happened. They knew Trask had been set up. They knew who had been in the cell with him. And they were waiting to see how this would end. Reed was leaning against the far fence, his hands tucked into his pockets, watching the yard the way a man watches the tide. Not to fight it, but to know when to move. Gabe stepped up beside him. "Tell me what you think," he said quietly, not looking at him. Reed didn't react right away. He let a beat pass, his eyes still scanning the yard, measuring the air. Then, finally, he sighed. "I think you're in more trouble than usual," he muttered. "I figured that much." Reed exhaled through his nose, his head tilting slightly. "Trask ain't the kind to let things go. You already knew that. But now, you ain't just some new guy getting in his way. You're the man who got him thrown in the hole. He'll come for you the second those doors open." "That's what Barnes is counting on," Gabe said. Reed gave a slow nod. "That's exactly what he's counting on." Gabe let the moment settle before shifting slightly, lowering his voice just enough that no one else could hear. "Why isn't he just having me killed?" Reed turned his head just a fraction, watching him now. "You mean the easy way?" "Yeah." Reed was quiet for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. "Because he already tried that before. And it almost cost him his job." Gabe's jaw tensed. "When?" "About 2 years ago," Reed muttered. "There was a guy, ex-military like you, tough, stood his ground. Barnes hated him, tried every trick in the book to break him, same way he's doing to you. But the guy wouldn't fold. So Barnes arranged an accident, got a few guards on board, had them jump him in the showers, broke him up real bad. Said he slipped, but it didn't end there." Gabe stayed silent, letting Reed take his time. "The guy wasn't supposed to make it," Reed continued. "But he did. Ended up in the infirmary, barely hanging on. Some outside lawyer caught wind of it, started asking questions. It made enough noise that the warden had to pretend he cared. Barnes got put under the microscope for a while, almost lost his spot." Gabe exhaled slowly, pieces falling into place. "So, now he's being careful," he murmured. Reed nodded. "He's not dumb enough to put his hands on you directly. Not anymore. So, he's doing the next best thing. setting the pieces in place so that when you die, it don't come back to him. Trask, Reed confirmed, and if it ain't him, it'll be someone else. Barnes don't need to pull the trigger himself. He just needs to make sure the gun is loaded and pointed in your direction. Gabe absorbed that, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides. So that's the play, he said quietly. He's building a wall of bodies between us, letting the pieces move themselves, and he'll keep doing it, Reed muttered. As long as it works. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Reed shifted, glancing at him with something close to amusement. I gotta say, Steele, I expected you to be in bad shape by now. Thought maybe you'd start looking a little cracked around the edges. But you don't, do you? Gabe exhaled, slow and steady. Not yet. Reed studied him for a second longer, then shook his head. Well, he muttered, that's good news for you. Bad news for Barnes. Gabe let his gaze sweep across the yard, watching the men, watching the structure, the rhythm of who moved where, who spoke to who held power. Maybe it's time he started feeling some pressure too, he said. Reed smirked. Now you're thinking. Gabe nodded once, his mind already shifting, already calculating the next move. He had spent his entire life on battlefields, in war zones, navigating systems designed to kill him. Ironwood was no different. A week passed. A week of waiting. A week of watching. A week of knowing that the moment Trask was released from the hole, there would be a reckoning. Gabe had spent his time the only way he knew how, preparing. He had learned every detail of his new cell, the sound of approaching footsteps, the subtle changes in movement that signaled when the guards were near and when they were purposefully absent. He had studied the men in the yard, the ones who nodded in quiet approval at what he had done, the ones who kept their distance, the ones who were watching, waiting, ready to see how this would all play out. And he had waited. Because Trask wasn't the kind of man to let things go. And Barnes wasn't the kind of man to let an opportunity pass. By the time the day arrived, Gabe already knew it before the doors opened. The tension in the air had changed. Subtle but sharp. An invisible ripple that carried through the tier, through the inmates who had spent enough years inside these walls to sense when something was about to happen. He was standing in the yard, pacing near the far end of the fence, when the first shift in energy came. Then, the murmur of voices. Then, the slow, purposeful thud of boots against the pavement. Gabe turned. Trask was standing at the entrance to the yard, fresh from solitary. His stance loose, but coiled with something deep, something violent. For a moment, neither man moved. Then, Trask started walking. The conversation around them died completely. Every inmate knew what was about to happen. This wasn't some petty grudge, some throwaway fight that would end in a few weak punches and a split lip. This was something else. Trask stopped a few feet away, rolling his shoulders, his face unreadable. But his eyes burned. I told you, he muttered. Told you I was going to kill you next time I saw you. Gabe exhaled slowly. Then, let's get it over with. No hesitation, no pretense. Trask swung first. It came fast, a brutal right hook, all force and momentum, designed to break bone. Gabe moved just enough. He absorbed the impact across his shoulder instead of his jaw, felt the shock of it radiate through his muscles, but he had already turned into it, already bringing his own fist up, sharp, controlled, aiming for ribs. A brutal impact. Trask grunted but barely flinched, shoving forward with his full weight, trying to drive Gabe back, trying to control the fight. Gabe didn't let him. He planted his foot, twisted, turned Trask's momentum against him. An old combat trick, one designed to take a man bigger than you and make him hit the ground first. Trask slammed into the pavement, hard, but he was already rolling, already moving. Then he was up again. Gabe barely had time to set himself before Trask came at him, faster now, more brutal. He wasn't trying to test him anymore. He was trying to end this. A strike to the ribs, sharp, powerful. Gabe gritted his teeth, forced himself to move with it. absorbed it without showing pain. Then, his turn. A palm strike to Trask's face, snapping his head back. Another to the throat. Fast. Controlled. Trask staggered, but only for a second. Then he was back, arms locking around Gabe's middle, lifting him slightly, trying to slam him into the ground. Gabe twisted, shifted his weight, drove an elbow into the back of Trask's head. Another strike, this time to the kidney. Trask faltered. Gabe exploited it. He grabbed the back of Trask's head and brought his knee up. Once, twice. The second impact sending blood splattering onto the concrete. The men watching stayed silent. No one wanted to interrupt this. No one wanted to stop it. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was survival. Trask staggered but didn't fall. His nose was bleeding, his breathing rough, but the fury in his eyes only deepened. "You ain't walking out of this one," he growled. Gabe didn't answer, because Trask wasn't walking out of this one either. He waited for Trask's next move, waited for the moment the man came in too wild, too angry, too reckless. Then he ended it. Trask lunged. Gabe stepped inside the attack. A sharp twist, then a brutal elbow to the jaw. Trask stumbled. Another strike, a precise, deadly shot to the solar plexus. The breath left Trask's lungs in a wheeze, his knees buckling for the first time. Gabe didn't stop. A final strike, his fist connecting with Trask's temple, sending the bigger man crashing to the pavement. Then, silence. Trask wasn't moving. His chest rose and fell, slow, pained, but he didn't get up. Gabe exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, feeling the slow, burning ache in his muscles. He had felt worse. Much worse. He straightened, turned his head slightly, and saw Barnes. The head guard was standing at the edge of the yard, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Then, a slow, knowing smirk. Gabe held his stare. Barnes tilted his head slightly. Then he turned and walked away. Gabe felt the message loud and clear. This wasn't over, not even close. The next 48 hours passed in a haze of routine, tension, and the dull, aching pulse of bruises that ran deep beneath Gabe's skin. He had won, but victories in Ironwood came with consequences. Trask was out of the picture. For now, they had dragged him off the yard, his body limp but still breathing. The damage severe enough that even the guards couldn't ignore it. The infirmary would keep him for a while, patching him up, keeping him sedated, maybe even stitching him back together just well enough to send him after Gabe again. But that was a problem for later, because Gabe had his own problems to deal with. He had expected retaliation from Barnes, something immediate, a response designed to make him suffer for taking Trask out of commission. But instead, the guards had only thrown him into solitary. No beatings, no threats, just a cold, windowless space where time had no meaning, where the only sound was the occasional clang of metal doors shifting in the distance. A different kind of punishment. Barnes wanted him to feel trapped, to strip him of control, of movement, of any advantage he might have gained in that fight. But what Barnes didn't know was that Gabe had been through worse. He had been locked in rooms darker than this, in places that smelled of sweat and fear, where men screamed in languages he barely understood. Solitary didn't break him. It just made him think, and what he thought about was getting out. Because now, it wasn't just a possibility. Now, it was real. The moment the heavy steel door groaned open, when the guard stepped in and muttered, "You got a visitor," the feeling returned, low and steady in his chest. Hope. He was led through the halls in silence, past guards who watched him just a little too closely, past inmates who had heard about the fight, past the ever-present weight of Barnes's system pressing in from all sides. He had won the battle against Trask, but Barnes was still the one controlling the war. For now, the visitation room was the same as before. Cold, sterile, designed to remind every man who stepped inside that he was still caged. Gabe didn't need the reminder. He felt it in every breath. But when he saw Grayson sitting across from the glass, suit neat, expression unreadable, papers stacked beside him with careful precision. The weight in Gabe's chest lightened just slightly. He picked up the receiver. Grayson did the same. "Steele!" the lawyer greeted, his voice steady. "Grayson!" A brief pause. Then the older man exhaled, leaning slightly toward the glass. "I've got news. And this time, it's good." Gabe didn't react, but something inside him shifted. "How good?" Grayson's lips pressed together for a moment before he nodded slightly, as if reassuring himself before speaking. "We're done waiting," he said. "Everything we needed to challenge your conviction is in place. We have the suppressed footage, we have the falsified reports, and we have the testimony of one of the officers involved in the cover-up." Gabe's fingers curled slightly around the receiver. "Who?" "A rookie cop from the original case," Grayson said. He didn't know the full extent of what was happening back then, but he knew enough to realize something was off. Now, with enough pressure, he's willing to talk. Gabe exhaled slowly, absorbing it. "What does that mean for me?" Grayson leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, sharpening. "It means that if everything moves the way it should, you'll be out of here in a week." The words landed like a hammer. A week. 7 days. After everything, after months of being trapped inside this system, it was finally happening. But then, reality settled back in. Barnes. Gabe's grip on the receiver tightened just slightly. "How much does the warden know?" Grayson's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Nothing yet," he admitted. "But he'll know soon. Once the paperwork is filed, the appeal process will trigger an immediate hearing. The judge will see the evidence, and unless the system finds a way to stall us, it'll be over." Gabe exhaled through his nose. "They're going to try to stall you." "I know. Barnes is going to do worse." Grayson hesitated, then sighed. "That's why I'm telling you now. You need to keep your head down, Steele. Do not give him an excuse. He can't stop this legally." Gabe knew that. Barnes wasn't going to let him leave without a fight. "I just have to make it a week," he muttered, more to himself than to Grayson. Grayson nodded. "A week," he confirmed. "Don't give them an opening." Gabe breathed slowly, steadying the weight pressing into his ribs. He had come into this place expecting to die inside it. Freedom was close enough to taste. "A week. One last battle. I'll make it," he said quietly. And for the first time since this started, he believed it. Barnes didn't find out right away. Ironwood had its own rhythm. A slow, grinding machine where information moved through carefully controlled channels, whispered from guard to guard, passed through unseen hands before it ever reached the ones who mattered. But in a place like this, secrets never stayed hidden for long. 3 days after the lawyer's visit, Barnes caught wind of it. It came to him the way all dangerous things did. Quiet, subtle, buried beneath layers of daily routine. A passing comment, a shift in behavior. The way certain guards who had always carried themselves with quiet confidence suddenly looked uneasy, as if they could feel the walls closing in. At first, he didn't believe it. It wasn't possible. Steele wasn't leaving. Men like him didn't just walk away. But then, the confirmation came. Through channels he trusted. Through the right whispers at the right time. The appeal had been filed. The evidence had surfaced. The process had started. Steele was getting out. Barnes sat behind his desk for a long time that night, staring at the surface, fingers pressed together, thinking he should have killed him sooner. But that was the problem, wasn't it? They couldn't just kill him outright. Not now. Not after everything. Not after what had happened the last time they had tried to make a problem disappear. The system only allowed so many mistakes before someone from the outside started asking questions. And Barnes had already used up his share, but that didn't mean there weren't other ways. Steele was leaving. That didn't mean he had to walk out in one piece. Barnes leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Then he made a decision. It was time to make sure Steele never left Ironwood at all. The meeting took place in the quiet hours, when the administrative offices were mostly empty, when the last remnants of daylight had bled away, and the prison settled into the stillness that only came before something bad. Barnes stood in the center of the briefing room, hands resting on the table, watching as the other guards filtered in. Some were men he had worked with for years, Others were newer, younger, still learning the way things really worked in a place like this. But all of them shared something in common. The same anger, the same resentment, the same wound that had never fully closed. The death of one of their own, the man Steele had killed. They all knew the story. They had all felt the weight of it, the bitter taste of watching one of their own go down, and knowing the man responsible had survived, had continued breathing when he should have been buried. They had spent months watching Steele walk through their halls, unbroken, undefeated, untouched in ways that should have never been allowed. Now, he was leaving. Barnes let the silence stretch, let it settle, let them feel it. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm not going to waste time explaining why we're here," he said, his voice low, even. "You already know." He scanned the room, watching their faces, gauging their reactions, waiting to see who would hesitate, who would need more convincing. None of them did. "Good. We had one chance to make this right," Barnes continued. "We were supposed to break him. He was supposed to fall in line. He was supposed to rot in here, just like every other man who's put a cop in the ground." A pause. But he didn't. He let that sink in, let the anger in the room start to simmer. Now, he thinks he's walking out of here a free man. The tension shifted. Barnes saw it, felt it. The quiet, controlled rage settling into their shoulders, tightening their expressions, twisting their silence into something dangerous. Then, he gave them what they needed. "I'm telling you right now, he isn't leaving." A ripple of reaction, flickers of agreement, small nods. The quiet, unspoken decision settling between them. One of the younger guards, Carter, the kind of man who had spent his entire career learning to hate men like Steele, clenched his jaw. "So what do we do?" he asked. Barnes exhaled slowly. "We wait." A few of them glanced at each other, uncertain. Barnes let them sit in it for a second before he leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "We do this right," he said. "We do this smart. We don't give the warden a reason to start sniffing around. We don't give his lawyer an excuse to push harder. We do what should have been done from the beginning." A beat of silence. Then, the final piece. "We hit him the night before his release." This time, no one hesitated. It was a perfect storm. The last night before a prisoner was processed out. The last moment where he still belonged to the system, where everything that happened to him could still be controlled. By the time morning came, it would be too late. They had one shot. Barnes straightened, his gaze sweeping across the room, locking onto each of them, ensuring they understood exactly what was at stake. "We make sure he never walks out those gates." The weight of the decision sealed itself into the air. A slow, collective shift as they nodded, one by one. It was done. Barnes allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Because this time, Steele wasn't going to win. The last day inside Ironwood felt different. Not because the walls had changed, not because the routines had shifted, but because Gabe could feel the weight of something coming. It was in the air. A pressure. A subtle but unmistakable shift in the way the guards moved, in the way they watched him, in the way conversations quieted just a little too quickly when he walked past. He had spent too many years reading environments, too many years recognizing the moment just before a fight, just before a strike, just before the air broke under the weight of something inevitable. Barnes was planning something, and it was coming soon. Gabe didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge it, didn't let them see the way he was already preparing. Instead, he went to find Reed. The yard was quieter than usual. The overcast sky cast a dull gray light over the concrete, stretching shadows long and thin across the ground. It felt like the pause before a storm, the last breath before something cracked open. Reed was where he always was, leaning against the far fence, watching the yard with the same measured, careful gaze, never looking like he was waiting for anything, but always aware of everything. Gabe walked up beside him, keeping his posture loose, keeping his voice even. "You ever get the feeling something's about to happen?" Reed didn't turn his head, but a slow smirk pulled at the edge of his mouth. "What? You finally figuring that out?" Gabe exhaled through his nose, watching the men across the yard, watching the way the guards lingered just a little too long near the perimeter, watching the way no one seemed willing to get too close to him. "Barnes isn't letting me walk out of here," he said. "Not without trying something first." Reed's smirk faded slightly. He shifted, rolling his shoulders. "Yeah," he muttered. "Figured as much." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, Gabe said the thing that had been sitting heavy in his mind all morning. "When I leave, he's coming for you next." Reed didn't react right away, didn't argue, because he already knew. Barnes wasn't just about control. He was about revenge. He had spent months trying to break Gabe, trying to reduce him to nothing, trying to turn him into just another lost name inside these walls. And now, when that plan had failed, when Gabe was walking free, he was going to need a new target, and Reed was the only one left standing too close. Reed sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw, his fingers absently tapping against the chain-link fence. "Barnes won't be subtle about it either," he muttered. "He won't play the long game this time. He'll move fast. Get me sent to solitary. Get me thrown in with the wrong people. Maybe even try to put me in the ground himself, just to make sure I don't get in the way of his next plan." Gabe nodded slowly. "That's why we stop him first." Reed turned his head slightly, finally looking at him. "You got an idea?" Gabe exhaled, his mind already working through the steps, already laying the pieces into place. "Barnes has been running this place unchecked for years. He's careful, but he's not untouchable. If I can get out, I can pull enough strings to make sure he doesn't last much longer." Reed let that settle, his expression thoughtful. "You mean go after him from the outside?" "Exactly. And how do you plan on doing that?" Gabe's fingers curled slightly at his sides. "I have a lawyer who knows the system, a journalist who's already sniffing around, and a case that's about to get national attention. Barnes isn't just a corrupt guard. He's part of something bigger. If we can connect him to the officers who covered up my case, if we can prove he's been running Ironwood like his own personal fight club, we can bury him before he even sees it coming." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he muttered, "that could work. But it means you need to get out first. And stay out," Gabe added. "Right." Another pause. Then Reed let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "You know, when you first got here, I didn't think you'd last a week." Gabe smirked. "Neither did I." Reed chuckled, low and dry, shaking his head again. "But now you're walking out. And me?" He exhaled. "I'm still stuck in here." Gabe turned his head slightly, meeting his gaze, something firm settling behind his expression. "Not for long," he said. Reed studied him, his jaw tightening slightly. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "All right, Steele," he muttered. "Let's take Barnes down." The night was quiet, too quiet. Gabe had spent enough time in war zones to recognize the feeling. The kind of stillness that wasn't real. The kind that came when an enemy was already in motion, when the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment things erupted into violence. He lay on his bunk, eyes closed but not sleeping, muscles loose but not relaxed, body still but coiled, listening to the prison around him, the distant murmur of voices, the faint scrape of boots against concrete, the soft clatter of something metallic being handled where it shouldn't be. A setup being prepared. A trap being laid. Barnes was coming. He had known this was the moment Barnes had been waiting for. The final act. The last move before Gabe was free. Because if Barnes had let things play out, if he had allowed Gabe to step through those gates, he would have lost. Completely. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about power, control, about proving that no one, no matter how skilled, how strong, how disciplined, could walk into his prison and leave on their own terms. But Gabe had no intention of leaving this place on Barnes's terms. The sound came minutes later, the sharp click of his cell door sliding open. Not a loud crash, not an alarm. A quiet, controlled move, the kind that didn't come with permission from above. The kind that meant Barnes wasn't just here to make a point. He was here to finish things. Gabe opened his eyes. 5 men stepped inside, 3 guards, 2 inmates. And behind them, Barnes. The head guard stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable, his shadow stretching long against the dim light spilling from the hallway behind him. Gabe slowly sat up, feet touching the cold concrete, shoulders rolling as he adjusted to the moment. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. He already knew how this was going to play out. Barnes exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You should have taken the easy way out, Steele," he muttered. Gabe let a slow breath escape his nose. "This is the easy way?" Barnes smirked. "Oh, it will be." Then the first punch came. A heavy boot connected with his ribs, fast and brutal, slamming into his side before he had fully risen to his feet, forcing him backward against the wall. He absorbed the impact, let the pain settle, let his body adjust, let the fight begin on his terms. The second strike came from the left. A baton swung hard, aiming for his ribs. He moved. Not far, just enough. The baton slammed into the concrete instead, jarring the man's grip. Gabe exploited the opening. He lunged, catching the man's wrist, twisting, snapping his elbow in the wrong direction. The guard barely had time to cry out before Gabe drove a knee into his gut, sending him crashing to the floor. Then the others moved in at once, a fist to his shoulder, a baton against his back, a foot hooking behind his ankle, trying to drag him down. He let them think it was working. Then he turned, swinging hard, his fist connecting with the nearest man's jaw, sending him sprawling backward, head cracking against the bars. Another guard lunged. He caught him mid-motion, shifting his weight, turning the momentum against him, slamming him chest first into the wall. The 2 inmates were on him next. They were stronger than the guards, bigger, used to fights like this. But Gabe had fought worse. One swung a sharpened toothbrush, a prison shank meant for a quick, ugly kill. Gabe dodged left, let the strike pass, caught the man's wrist, twisted it back so fast and hard that the bones snapped. The second man tackled him, driving both of them into the bunk. They hit the steel frame hard. Pain exploded down Gabe's spine, but he locked his legs around the man's torso, twisted, threw his weight. The fight was brutal, fast, relentless. Every strike felt like it carried months of rage, months of planning, months of Barnes making sure that this moment happened exactly as he had imagined it. Gabe fought, survived, endured. But the numbers worked against him. They wore him down. A baton cracked against his knee. A fist split the side of his lip. A boot slammed into his ribs again, forcing air from his lungs. Barnes stepped forward, slow and deliberate, watching as Gabe staggered back against the wall, blood dripping from his mouth, one arm wrapped around his ribs. "Not so tough now," huh?" Barnes murmured, rolling his neck, his muscles flexing under his uniform. "Bet you wish you stayed down." Gabe lifted his head, his breath steady, his eyes still sharp. "Not yet." Then he attacked, a final, desperate move. Barnes barely had time to react before Gabe was on him, driving his elbow into his ribs, catching his wrist, twisting it so hard the bones cracked. Barnes cursed, stumbling back. Gabe pressed forward until something crashed against the back of his head. A baton, hard. Pain exploded through his skull, his vision swimming, his knees buckling. Barnes straightened, panting, wiping blood from his mouth. "Should have stayed down, soldier boy." Gabe forced himself to lift his head, one last time, refusing to fall. Then the voice came. "What the hell is going on in here?" Everything froze. The room shifted. The air changed. The guards stiffened. The inmates stopped moving. Barnes turned, his face twisting as the warden stepped through the doorway. A second later, more guards flooded in. Not Barnes's men. Real oversight. The warden's face was like stone, his eyes sharp, his expression a mask of something between fury and disbelief. Barnes exhaled slowly, straightening, schooling his features. "Sir," he began, "this inmate..." "This inmate is walking out of here in the morning," the warden snapped. "And you thought you could pull this again?" Barnes said nothing, but his face twitched. "I covered for you once," the warden growled, stepping closer. "I buried the last mess you made. I won't do it again." Gabe exhaled slowly, blood dripping from his mouth, watching the exchange. The warden turned to the other guards. "Take Steele to the infirmary. Make sure he's processed out tomorrow." Then, to Barnes, his voice cold. "And you? If you pull something like this again, I won't be able to protect you." Barnes said nothing, but Gabe saw it in his eyes. "You think this is over?" he murmured. Gabe didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't let himself react, because that was what Barnes wanted. He wanted to see something break, to see something shift, to know that even though he had lost this round, he still had a way to cut deeper. "You walk out of here, fine," Barnes continued, his fingers tightening ever so slightly. "Enjoy it while you can. But you took something from me, Steele. A friend for a friend." A pause. "So, I'm taking one from you." Gabe's body didn't move, didn't react, but his mind locked onto the words with sharp precision. Barnes smiled. "You know exactly who I mean, don't you?" he murmured, leaning in just slightly. "You think Reed's gonna walk out of here unscathed? You think I'm gonna let that slide?" Gabe exhaled slowly, controlled, steady, even as his blood burned beneath his skin. Barnes tilted his head, watching, studying, searching for the reaction he was so desperate to pull out. "It won't be right away," he mused. "That's too obvious. But in a few weeks, maybe months, something's gonna happen. A slip on the stairs, a shank in the yard, a transfer to the wrong block at the wrong time." He leaned in just a little closer, his breath slow, measured. "A friend for a friend." The moment stretched. The guards shifted slightly, uneasy. They knew this wasn't standard. They knew Barnes was pushing his limits, but no one moved to stop him. Not yet. Gabe's pulse was steady. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "I warned you once, Barnes." Barnes smirked. "And I didn't listen." "No." A pause. Then Gabe leaned in, slow and deliberate, his eyes locking onto Barnes's with something cold, something final. "But you will." Barnes's smirk didn't fade, but the amusement behind it did. A flicker of something else. Uncertainty, maybe even the first faint stirrings of doubt. The moment shattered when the warden cleared his throat sharply. "That's enough," he snapped, stepping forward. "Barnes, step back. Steele, move!" The guards moved in. Barnes's grip lingered for a fraction of a second longer, just long enough to remind Gabe that this wasn't over. Then, finally, he let go. Gabe turned, walking toward the exit, toward the end of this chapter, toward the gate that would finally open for him tomorrow. But as he walked, as the guards led him out of the cell, out of the block, past the walls that had tried to break him, he wasn't thinking about his own freedom anymore. He was thinking about Reed, because Barnes wasn't bluffing. And that meant the war wasn't over yet. The sun hit different on the other side of the gate. For the first time in months, Gabe felt the warmth on his skin without the weight of concrete walls closing in around him, without the ever-present hum of guards watching his every move, without the knowledge that every step he took inside Ironwood had been measured, calculated, designed to break him. But as he walked through those gates, as the metal doors locked behind him with a final echoing thud, he didn't feel free. Not yet. His ribs still ached from the beating in his cell. His jaw was still sore where a baton had caught him the night before. The bruises along his torso and arms were still fresh, dark and swollen beneath the clothes Grayson had brought for him, a simple button-down and jeans that felt too light after months of thick prison fabric. He looked free, but inside, something was still coiled tight. He kept walking, one step after another, until the sight of Grayson's car came into view, parked near the curb just beyond the gates. The lawyer stood beside it, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, waiting. Gabe didn't stop. He stepped forward, opened the passenger door, slid inside. Grayson followed a second later, settling into the driver's seat, adjusting his cuffs before exhaling slowly, his hands resting on the wheel but not turning the key yet, as if giving them both a moment to acknowledge what had just happened. "How do you feel?" Grayson asked finally, his voice even. Gabe tilted his head slightly, his gaze shifting toward the side mirror, watching as the prison loomed behind them, as the gates that had held him captive remained locked, separating him from the place that had tried to bury him. "I'll feel better when we finish this." Grayson nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. "Then, let's talk." He turned the key, the engine humming to life as he pulled away from the curb, easing onto the road, leaving Ironwood in the rear view. They didn't speak again until they were in the city, seated in the back corner of a small, discreet office in a law firm that wasn't on any billboard, that didn't cater to the wealthy, but to those who needed someone willing to fight. Grayson's name was on the door, but his presence in the room felt more like that of a strategist than a lawyer. Someone used to navigating battlefields where the enemy wore suits and badges instead of uniforms and knives. Gabe leaned back in his chair, absorbing the details of the office. No personal photos, no unnecessary decorations, just stacks of case files, a few plaques that suggested Grayson had once cared about recognition but had long since stopped needing it, and a single desk lamp casting a dim glow over the paperwork between them. Grayson set a thick folder down, flipping it open, the sound of paper shifting, filling the room. "Barnes isn't going to stop," Gabe muttered before the lawyer could speak. Grayson sighed, nodding. "No, he's not. And he's going after Reed. That's a problem." Gabe narrowed his eyes slightly. "Then we fix it." Grayson adjusted his glasses, tapping a finger against the folder. "You spent months inside that prison, Steele. You know how this works. Taking Barnes down isn't as simple as exposing him. You've already seen it. He's protected. The warden covered for him before, and he'll do it again. If you go after him head-on, you won't just be fighting one man. You'll be fighting the entire system that's been keeping him in power. Then we don't go after him head-on," Gabe said. "We go after the system." Grayson studied him for a moment before exhaling, nodding slightly. "Good, because that's exactly what we're going to do." He flipped the first page in the folder, revealing a printed report, one filled with disciplinary write-ups, internal complaints, and records of excessive force. Barnes's record. "This is everything I've been able to dig up," Grayson said. Some of it was buried deep. The official reports paint him as a dedicated officer, but the real story? It's ugly. He's been accused of excessive force at least 6 times in the last 5 years. Every case disappeared. No real consequences. No suspensions. Nothing. Gabe skimmed the pages, his eyes narrowing as he recognized some of the names. Men who had spoken about the abuse inside Ironwood, but had never lived long enough to prove it. "How do we use it?" Gabe asked. Grayson leaned forward slightly. "The best way to take Barnes down isn't just proving he's dirty. It's making sure the people protecting him go down with him. We need to expose the warden, the guards who covered for him, the system that let him run that prison like his own personal empire." "Jessica can help with that," Gabe muttered, already thinking ahead, already seeing the pieces moving. "She's been digging into this for months. If we can connect Barnes to the cops who covered up my case, if we can show that corruption isn't just inside Ironwood but spreads beyond it, we'll have something big enough that they can't ignore it." Grayson nodded. "It won't be easy," he warned. "You're free now, but that doesn't mean you're safe. The second we start pulling at these threads, people are going to push back. Hard. And Barnes?" He exhaled. "He knows exactly who you are. He knows exactly what you're capable of. If he feels that pressure closing in, he's not going to wait. He'll come after you first." Gabe didn't hesitate. "Then we don't give him the chance." Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line, but after a moment, he nodded. "All right then. We do this fast. We do it clean. And we make sure when Barnes falls, he takes the whole system down with him." Gabe leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the lawyer. "And we make sure Reed makes it out alive." Grayson didn't speak right away, but there was something in his gaze, a quiet understanding, An acknowledgement that this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was personal. "We will," he said finally. Gabe sat back, exhaling slowly, feeling something settle inside him. For months his fight had been about survival. Now, it was about finishing this. The plan had to move fast. Barnes wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let things happen. He wasn't going to wait for Gabe to settle in, wasn't going to give him time to build his case. No, he was already thinking ahead, already planning his next move, already looking for ways to neutralize the problem before it grew too big to contain. That meant Gabe had to be faster. That meant Reed had to survive. And that meant they needed to hit Barnes before he saw it coming. The first call was to Jessica. Gabe had barely stepped out of Grayson's office when he dialed her number, moving quickly, stepping into the alley beside the building, away from the quiet hum of passing cars, away from any ears that might be listening. She picked up on the second ring. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you," she said, her voice sharp, quick, the tone of someone who had been waiting for this moment just as long as he had. "You heard?" Gabe asked, keeping his voice low. "That you walked out of Ironwood alive?" "Yeah, I heard. Thought I'd have to start writing your obituary." "Not yet." A pause. Then Jessica's voice shifted, cutting through the tension with precision. "What's the play?" Gabe exhaled, stepping further into the alley, leaning against the brick wall as he let his mind settle into the plan. Let the pieces arrange themselves in the way they needed to. "We take Barnes down," he said simply, "and we don't give him time to react." Jessica was silent for a moment, then she let out a slow breath. "I've been waiting for you to say that." She wasn't just a journalist. She was an investigator, a fighter, someone who had spent years uncovering corruption and dragging it into the light, only to watch powerful men twist the system to protect themselves. She knew how this worked. "I've been digging since you went in," she continued. "I have enough to put pressure on the warden, but it's not enough to take them both down. We need something bigger." "We'll get it," Gabe said. "How?" He exhaled, his mind already moving to the next step, already seeing the opening they needed. "We use Reed." Jessica hesitated. "Gabe, not like that," he said quickly, pushing off the wall. "Barnes is coming for him. That's not a question. If we don't do something, he's a dead man walking." "I know," she muttered, "but I don't like the idea of using him as bait." "We're not. We're giving him a way out." A long silence stretched between them. Then Jessica sighed. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need." Gabe glanced down the alley, scanning the street beyond, feeling the weight of what was coming settle into his chest. "We're going to give Barnes the rope to hang himself, and we're going to make sure the whole world is watching when he does." Jessica had never been inside Ironwood before. She had spent years investigating men like Barnes, exposing the systems that allowed them to thrive. But walking into the belly of the beast was different. There was no buffer between her and the corruption this time. No second-hand accounts, no carefully curated interviews, just her, the walls, and the weight of knowing that if things went wrong, she wasn't walking out of here without a fight. The guard leading her through the hallway barely looked at her, his posture stiff, his movements clipped. She knew what that meant. He wasn't thrilled about this meeting, and whoever had authorized it had done so reluctantly. Reed was waiting in the visitation room, sitting on the far side of the table, arms resting on the surface, his expression unreadable. Jessica took the chair across from him, placing her bag on the floor beside her. No pleasantries, no wasted words. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small black device, no larger than a pack of gum, setting it down between them with slow, deliberate precision. Reed stared at it for a moment, then exhaled through his nose. "That what I think it is?" he muttered. Jessica nodded. "It's got a built-in mic, sensitive enough to pick up conversations from across the room. All you have to do is keep it on you, and make sure it's close when the time comes." Reed's fingers tapped lightly against the table, his gaze shifting to the door behind her for a brief second before coming back to the device. "And what if they search me?" "They won't," Jessica said. "Not for this." A pause. "You sure about that?" Jessica tilted her head slightly. "No," she admitted. "But that's the risk we're taking. Reed studied her for a long moment, then picked up the recorder, turning it over in his hands. "How do you get it out?" "You don't," Jessica said. "Someone else will." Another beat of silence. Then Reed smirked. "Well," he muttered, slipping the device into the waistband of his jumpsuit. "Guess we'll see how this plays out." Jessica sat back, watching as the guard behind her shifted, signaling that their time was up. "We'll be waiting," she said quietly. Reed nodded once. "Then I'll make it count." The days that followed were the longest of Gabe's life. He sat in the back of Jessica's car, parked in an alley just outside the city, the engine off, the only sound the occasional distant murmur of street noise and the quiet tapping of Jessica's nails against the dashboard. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Either the plan had worked, or Reed was dead. Gabe kept his breathing steady, his pulse controlled, his thoughts measured, but the tension sat like a weight in his chest. He had spent months surviving, adapting, fighting back when necessary. But this was different. This wasn't his fight anymore. Reed was in there alone, and he had no idea what was happening behind those walls. Jessica glanced at the clock on her phone. "It's been too long," she muttered. Gabe didn't respond. Then, movement. A dark figure slipped into the alley, moving fast but controlled, keeping to the shadows. Gabe tensed slightly, his fingers flexing, ready for anything. Then, the man stepped into the dim glow of the street lamp, a courier bag slung across his shoulder, a neutral expression on his face. Someone they had never met before. Jessica didn't hesitate. She opened the door, stepping out, meeting him halfway. The man didn't say a word. He simply reached into his bag, pulled out a small black device, and pressed it into her hand. Then, just as quickly, he turned and disappeared back into the night. Jessica stared down at the recorder. Then she turned back to the car, slipping inside, setting the device on the dashboard between them. Gabe exhaled slowly, reaching forward, pressing play. And the sound that filled the car was the sound of hell. A sharp impact, a grunt of pain. A voice, one of the guards. "You should have kept your head down, Reed." A crack. A groan. More voices, more fists, more violence. The unmistakable sounds of a man being beaten by those who believed they were untouchable. Then, Barnes's voice. "This is what happens to people who don't understand how things work." Another impact. A cough. Wet. Struggling. Then, Barnes again, his voice lower, colder, quieter. "You think Steele's gonna save you?" A pause. Then Reed's voice, hoarse but unbroken. "No," he muttered, "but he's gonna bury you." Another impact. Then silence. Gabe reached forward, stopping the recording. The car felt impossibly still. Jessica exhaled, her hands tightening into fists. "That's enough," she muttered. "That's more than enough." Gabe nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "It's time to end this." Jessica pulled out her phone. "I'll call Grayson. We take this straight to the Department of Corrections, the state. Everyone who can't ignore it. Barnes is finished." Gabe sat back, his pulse steady, his focus sharp, his mind already thinking ahead. Barnes was going to lose everything. But before that happened, Gabe was going to make sure he knew exactly who had destroyed him. The investigation moved fast, faster than anyone had expected. Within 24 hours of the audio leak, the Department of Corrections had launched a formal inquiry. Within 48, the warden had been forced to issue a statement, one carefully worded but ultimately useless, meant to buy time, to salvage whatever authority he had left. But the pressure was mounting. The public wasn't letting this go. By the end of the first week, multiple agencies had stepped in. State investigators, legal teams, civil rights watchdogs, all picking apart the layers of abuse that had been allowed to fester inside Ironwood for years. And at the center of it all was Barnes. The moment the recording had gone public, he had lost control of the narrative. He had spent years bending the system to his will, making sure that men like him could operate in the shadows, untouchable. But now, he was the one being hunted. Sure enough, Gabe was called to testify against Barnes. Grayson sat beside him, flipping through a legal pad, his expression calm, composed. but Gabe could see the calculation beneath it. They had been sitting in this waiting room for over an hour, surrounded by the kind of polished government offices that reeked of bureaucracy, the kind of places where careers were made or destroyed depending on who was in the hot seat. And today, it was Barnes. A young clerk stepped into the room, glancing between them before nodding toward Gabe. "They're ready for you." Gabe exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders before standing. Grayson didn't move to follow. "You've got this," he said simply. Gabe nodded once, stepping past him, moving through the quiet corridors until he was led into a conference room lined with officials. A mix of state investigators, attorneys, and department heads, all watching him with careful, measured expressions. They had questions, and he had answers. He told them everything. From the moment he had walked into Ironwood, from the first signs of Barnes's control, from the beatings, the setups, the intimidation tactics, he laid it all out, methodical, detailed, leaving no room for doubt. And when they asked about the recording, he played it for them again. Every punch, every threat, every word that had sealed Barnes's fate. The room was silent when it ended, the weight of it pressing into every person seated at the long, polished table. Then, finally, one of the investigators cleared her throat, setting down her pen. "Mr. Steele," she said, her tone careful but firm. "You understand that this is going to lead to a full criminal investigation." Gabe met her gaze, his expression steady. Good. The fallout was immediate. The media latched onto the story, amplifying it with every passing hour. The headlines painted the picture clearly. Exposed, prison abuse ring at Ironwood. Guards implicated in violent cover-ups. Every time the warden tried to deflect, new evidence surfaced. Every time the administration tried to stall, another wave of pressure hit. Barnes, once protected, once untouchable, was now the name on every headline, the face of a scandal that couldn't be buried. And he knew exactly who had done this to him. Barnes sat in his office. He stood near the window, looking down at the gates of Ironwood, watching the camera crews, the news vans, the people demanding justice for men he had spent years grinding beneath his boot. The door behind him opened. The warden stepped inside, his expression heavy, his movements those of a man who had already made a decision he didn't want to make. Barnes didn't turn. "It's done, isn't it?" he muttered. A long pause, then, "Yes." The words settled like lead. The warden sighed, stepping further inside, setting a file down on the desk. Barnes's suspension notice, the beginning of the formal termination process. "You should have kept your head down," the warden muttered. Barnes let out a low, bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "That what you're telling yourself?" he asked. The warden didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. This had been coming for a long time. And now, there was no stopping it. Back in the city, Gabe stood outside Grayson's office, phone in hand, watching the news feed playing on the screen. Barnes was leaving Ironwood, escorted out by 2 guards who used to follow his every order, now refusing to meet his eyes. The reporter's voice carried through the small speakers. "Barnes has officially been terminated following a swift investigation into the abuse allegations at Ironwood State Prison. The Department of Corrections has vowed sweeping reforms, while state officials have hinted at criminal charges on the horizon. What was once a career built on control has now ended in disgrace." Gabe exhaled slowly, locking the phone screen, slipping it back into his pocket. Jessica leaned against the wall beside him, crossing her arms. "That's one hell of a fall." Gabe nodded. The case moved through the courts at a speed that Barnes hadn't anticipated. He had seen inquiries before, had watched scandals erupt and fade, had even maneuvered through his own share of legal trouble in the past. But this was different. This wasn't just an internal review, some quietly handled disciplinary matter that would be buried under paperwork. This was public, televised. This was an avalanche, and he had nowhere to run. Gabe sat in the courtroom, hands folded, listening as the prosecution dismantled Barnes piece by piece. The charges had stacked against him quickly. Conspiracy to commit assault, obstruction of justice, excessive force, tampering with evidence. There was no spinning this, no technicality to slip through. The audio recording alone had been damning. But it wasn't just the tape that sealed Barnes's fate. Witnesses had come forward, former inmates willing to testify, guards who had distanced themselves the moment they saw which way the wind was blowing. Even the warden, who had once protected Barnes, had turned cold. The jury listened, their expressions grim, their verdict already forming in their minds before the trial had even reached its conclusion. Gabe recognized that look. He had seen it before in courtrooms where men were sentenced without a second thought. The difference was that, this time, the man sitting at the defense table had spent his life believing he was untouchable. The prosecutor presented their final statement, voice steady, methodical, each word landing with precision. They laid out what Barnes had done, not just to Gabe, not just to Reed, but to every man who had ever crossed him inside Ironwood. They spoke about the culture of abuse he had cultivated, the system he had corrupted, the lives he had destroyed. When it was over, the jury left the room. They were gone for less than a day. Barnes sat stiffly as they returned, eyes locked forward, face blank. But Gabe could see it, the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled against the table, the quiet, growing realization that there was no escape this time. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreman stood. Guilty on all counts. Barnes didn't flinch, didn't move, but his jaw clenched ever so slightly. Gabe exhaled, letting the words settle, feeling something shift inside him, not satisfaction, not triumph, but the finality of it. The judge let the courtroom settle before speaking. His voice carried, firm and deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. He addressed Barnes directly, calling him by name, calling him exactly what he was, a man who had abused his authority, who had turned his position into a weapon, who had inflicted pain without consequence for years. That was over now. The sentencing was swift. 18 years. No parole for the first 12. Barnes swallowed once. His fingers twitched. He sat motionless as the bailiff stepped behind him, as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, as the gavel struck down. It was done. Gabe watched as they led him away. He didn't fight. Didn't say a word. For the first time since all of this started, Barnes had no control left to wield. Gabe let out a slow breath. Not relief, not yet, but something close. He stood, turning toward the exit, pushing past the murmuring crowd, past the press waiting outside, stepping into the open air. This was finished, and Barnes was exactly where he belonged. The courtroom was behind him now, but Gabe didn't move right away. He stood on the courthouse steps, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment settle into his bones, not as a sharp, immediate thing, but as something slower, something deeper, something that had been building from the moment his life had been ripped away. He had been here before, standing in front of a judge, listening to a jury, hearing words that dictated the next years of his life. But the last time, the verdict had crushed him, had stolen something from him before he had even realized it was gone. That day, when they said guilty, when they sentenced him to prison for a crime he hadn't committed, for an act of survival that had been twisted into something else, he had felt a door slam shut in his mind. That night had never left him. The bar had been loud, music humming low beneath the buzz of conversation, the smell of beer and sweat thick in the air. He hadn't been looking for trouble, but trouble had found him. The off-duty cop had been drunk, angry, looking for a fight, and when Gabe had refused to back down, it had turned violent. A shove, a punch, the crack of a chair breaking. He had reacted on instinct, training, muscle memory, the kind of discipline that had been ingrained into him long before he ever walked into that place. He had defended himself, and for that, he had been thrown in a cell. Ironwood had been a war zone, but he had survived that too. The guards had tried to break him. The inmates had tried to test him. and for a time he had believed he was going to die in that place. Not because he wasn't strong enough to fight back, but because there were too many of them. Too many hands pushing down. Too many shadows waiting for the moment. He made a mistake, but he hadn't made a mistake. Barnes had underestimated him. Reed had been the only thing in that prison that had felt real. A man who didn't want anything from him, who wasn't looking for a fight, who had no angle to play. A man who had ended up behind bars for something that wasn't about greed or power or recklessness, but about family. Reed had protected his brother, and for that, he had been thrown in a cell too. Gabe exhaled, rolling his shoulders, feeling the stiffness in his ribs, the dull ache in his knuckles, reminders of every fight he had survived to get to this moment. He had spent his entire life knowing what it meant to fight for something. Now, for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to fight anymore. At least, not for himself. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about what came next. 2 years had passed. The city hadn't changed much, at least not in the ways that mattered. The same streets, the same bars, the same familiar rhythms of a world that had kept moving without him. But for Gabe, everything was different now. He sat in the corner of a quiet bar, nursing a drink that had started to sweat against the glass, listening to the distant hum of conversation. The place wasn't crowded, not the kind of bar where people came to get lost in the noise, but the kind where they sat with their thoughts, let time settle around them. It was the kind of place that let a man disappear if he wanted to. But tonight, Gabe wasn't disappearing. The door opened, letting in the cool night air, and Reed stepped inside. He looked different. Not in any way obvious, not older or changed in some dramatic way, but lighter. Like a man who had finally stopped looking over his shoulder. He scanned the bar once, then found Gabe, moving toward him with the same steady, measured steps he had always had. Gabe leaned back as Reed sat across from him, letting the silence stretch between them for a moment before offering a nod. "Didn't think I'd see you drinking alone," Reed muttered. "Didn't think I'd see you walking free." Reed smirked, signaling to the bartender, ordering a whiskey before turning back to Gabe. 2 years, he said, shaking his head slightly. "Feels longer. Doesn't feel long enough." Reed chuckled. "Yeah, guess it doesn't." The bartender set the drink down, and Reed took a slow sip, letting it settle before speaking again. "You keep up with the fallout?" Gabe nodded. "Barnes never made it past his first year inside," he said. "Got himself into a fight he couldn't win. Guess he finally learned what it was like to be on the other side of the bars." Reed exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Fitting end." "Yeah." A pause. "And the warden?" Reed asked. "Resigned before they could push him out," Gabe said. "Avoided charges, but lost everything. Last I heard, he left the state." Reed smirked, tapping his fingers against the glass. "And you? You still spending your time tearing down guys like Barnes?" Gabe considered the question for a moment, then shrugged. "Not full-time," he admitted. "Jessica still does the heavy lifting. I help when I can. Feels like there's always another name, another prison, another guy who thinks he's untouchable." "There is," Reed muttered, "but that's not my fight anymore." Reed tilted his head slightly. "No, not the way it was," Gabe said. "I did what I had to do. I made sure Barnes didn't walk away from what he did. That was enough." Reed studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he muttered. "It was." Silence stretched again. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just a quiet understanding between two men who had survived something most wouldn't understand. Gabe glanced at him. "So, what's next for you?" Reed exhaled, rolling his shoulders slightly. "Not sure yet," he admitted. "Told myself I'd figure it out when I got out, but I guess I didn't think much past walking through those gates." "You ever think about going back home?" Reed smirked. "And do what?" "I don't know. Whatever guys like us do when we don't have anything left to fight." Reed let that sit for a second, then chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess I'll have to figure that out." They sat there for a while, finishing their drinks, letting the conversation drift. Not about prison or the past, but about things that didn't carry weight. It was easy, natural, the kind of conversation men had when they had made it through something together and didn't need to say out loud what they already knew. Eventually, Reed leaned back, setting his empty glass down. "Guess I owe you for getting me out of there." "You don't owe me anything," Gabe said simply. Reed smirked. "Still, if you ever need me, you know where to find me." Gabe nodded. "Same goes for you." Reed stood, stretching slightly before sliding a few bills onto the table. "Take care of yourself, Steele." "You too." Reed nodded once, then turned and walked out, disappearing into the night. Gabe sat there for a while, watching the door, then exhaled, picking up his glass, tilting it slightly, watching the way the light caught the last remnants of whiskey at the bottom. For the first time in years, he felt like he had nothing left to fight. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.